she was still alive. That's the part people often forget. For all the headlines that screamed, Princess Diana dead, for all the grainy photos of the mangled Mercedes in that Paris tunnel, there was a stretch of time, agonizing, fragile minutes, where Diana breathed, whispered, and fought. And in those fleeting moments, words were spoken, words that have since been buried in conflicting testimonies, twisted by rumor, and smothered by official silence. But what if I told you that those last words might not have been lost at all? What if Camilla, of all people, heard what the world was never supposed to hear? Eyewitnesses painted a haunting picture. Firefighters arriving at the crash scene found Diana conscious, trapped in the wreckage. Sergeant Xavier Gourmelin, one of the first responders, later revealed that she uttered a simple, heartbreaking line. "My God, what's happened?" It sounds ordinary, confused, disoriented. But it takes on a chilling weight when you realize it may have been one of the last things she ever said. Others insisted she asked about Dodi. Some swore she repeated, "Leave me alone." Which is it? Which was real? And why, decades later, do we still not have a clear answer? Perhaps because the truth was never meant to reach us. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Here's where the story splits in two. On the ground in Paris, first responders heard words no one can ever forget. In London, however, whispers suggest those words were passed up the chain, filtered, coded, and ultimately delivered to Charles and Camilla before the world ever learned of them. Imagine that for a moment. While the public clung to vague reports of serious injuries, Charles and Camilla may have already been told Diana's last words, her last moments, her final breath. Doesn't that change everything? Think about the cruel symmetry here. For years, Diana spoke openly about Camilla, calling her the third person in our marriage. She laid bare the humiliation, the betrayal, the heartbreak. And then, on the night she died, her words, perhaps her very last words, were carried not to her sons, not even to her sisters, but into the ears of the woman who had haunted her life. If Camilla did hear them, if Charles repeated them to her through hushed phone calls, what must that have felt like? Triumph? Horror? Guilt? We can only speculate. But one thing is certain. Camilla later admitted she and Charles knew details that weren't public. What could be more private, more devastating, than a dying princess's final words? Let's pause and ask, why would anyone hide such details? Wouldn't the world have wanted to know Diana's last message? Here's the contradiction. On one hand, sharing her words could have humanized her death even more, deepening the public's grief and fury. On the other, those words might have been too raw, too inconvenient, too damning for the monarchy to release. If Diana truly did say, "Leave me alone," imagine the public backlash. The image of a princess hunted to her death by paparazzi, begging for peace, would have destroyed what little credibility the royals still held. So instead, silence. A convenient fog of confusion. And into that silence stepped Camilla, quietly carrying what others never would. Now imagine Diana's sons. William and Harry slept at Balmoral that night, shielded from the chaos, unaware their mother was dying in a tunnel in Paris. They didn't hear her last words. They didn't know what she said. But Camilla might have. How does that sit with you? How does it feel to think the woman who replaced Diana in Charles's heart may have been entrusted with her final message, while her own children were kept in the dark? It's almost too cruel to contemplate. And yet, that's the reality we're left with. Here's where things get even more disturbing. Some close to Camilla claim she was deeply unsettled in the days after the crash, not just because of public hatred, but because of something she'd heard, something she couldn't unhear. If true, that could only mean one thing. Diana's last words weren't just about confusion or pain. They carried weight, perhaps blame, perhaps a plea, perhaps something Charles could never repeat publicly, but whispered to Camilla in the quiet privacy of their calls. That, more than anything, would explain her later confession that she and Charles knew more. Direct question to you. If Diana's last words were known by Camilla, do you believe we deserve to hear them? Or should they remain buried, a sacred secret between two women tied together by tragedy? It's a moral dilemma, between transparency and respect, between history and privacy. And yet, the fact that Camilla acknowledged hidden truths forces us to confront it. If we're denied Diana's voice in her final hour, how can we ever trust the story we were given? Let's also remember the irony. Diana spent her life fighting to be heard. Her panorama interview, her public speeches, her raw honesty about mental health and marriage. Her gift was in her voice. And yet, in death, even her voice was silenced. Not by accident, but by choice. The choice of those who held power. The choice of those who filtered information. The choice of those who decided what the public could and couldn't handle. Camilla's admission suggests she stood on the side of silence, holding on to a truth that belonged to the world. And so, the question lingers like a ghost. What did Diana say in those final breaths? Was it confusion? Was it fear? Was it anger? Was it a plea for her children? Whatever it was, it mattered enough to haunt Camilla decades later. Enough to slip from her lips when she finally broke her silence. Enough to remind us that history is not a fixed record. It's a story shaped by those who control the words. And in this case, those words may have been stolen from us forever. But if Camilla's knowledge of Diana's last words is unsettling, what followed inside Buckingham Palace that night is even more disturbing. Because while Diana lay broken in Paris, the palace wasn't preparing for grief. It was preparing for survival. The palace was quiet. Too quiet. Outside, the world was unraveling. News channels broadcasting shaky footage of the crash site. Anchors fumbling through updates. Ordinary people waking in disbelief to the possibility that Princess Diana might be gone. But inside Buckingham Palace and Balmoral Castle, a very different scene was unfolding. Emergency meetings, urgent phone calls, whispered conversations in hushed corridors. While Diana fought for her life in Paris, the palace was already preparing for her death. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? That as doctors bent over Diana's broken body, trying to keep her alive, courtiers in London were drawing up protocols, speeches, and strategies. And in the midst of it all, Charles and Camilla were not passive observers. They were participants. They were absorbing privileged information, weighing responses, and, according to Camilla's later admission, receiving knowledge the public would never hear. This wasn't just about grief. It was about optics, about control, about ensuring the monarchy survived the most explosive scandal of the century. Imagine the atmosphere at Balmoral, where the royal family had been holidaying. The Queen, Philip, Charles, William, Harry, everyone in the quiet Scottish estate was suddenly confronted with a nightmare. Diana was in Paris. The boys were asleep, and news was coming in by the minute. Here's the detail most people don't realize. Within hours of the crash, palace officials convened emergency meetings to discuss not just Diana's condition, but the monarchy's response. How would the death of the people's princess, divorced, estranged, yet adored, impact the crown? Would the public turn against them? Could the monarchy withstand the tidal wave of grief and fury? Now picture Camilla's role. Officially, she had no position, no title, no standing in royal matters. Yet she was in the loop. She received the same phone calls Charles did. She heard the same updates. Insiders suggest Charles leaned heavily on her that night, speaking to her more than to his own staff. This is telling, because it wasn't the Queen who steadied him. It wasn't even his advisors. It was Camilla. The woman Diana had named as the wedge in her marriage was suddenly central to the monarchy's survival playbook. Isn't that irony at its cruelest? The meetings themselves were clinical. Courtiers reviewed protocols for royal deaths. Operation Tay Bridge, the code name for the Queen Mother's eventual passing, was dusted off and adapted. But Diana wasn't the Queen Mother. She wasn't even technically royal anymore. That was the dilemma. How much honor should be given to her? How much recognition? The Queen was said to be reluctant. Diana, after all, was divorced. She was no longer Her Royal Highness. Why lower the flag to half-mast for a private citizen? That was the logic in the room. Cold. Detached. But outside those palace walls, millions were already weeping. See the contradiction? Inside, protocol. Outside, heartbreak. Direct question to you. What do you think mattered more to them in those early hours? The loss of Diana, or the preservation of the monarchy's image? If Camilla's later words are to be believed, the answer might be darker than we want to admit. She confirmed she and Charles knew more than the public did, which suggests the palace wasn't just reacting to events. They were managing them in real time, shaping the story before the world could even process the facts. Let's not overlook Charles's position here. He was torn between two realities. On one hand, his ex-wife was dying in a foreign hospital. On the other, His sons were sleeping peacefully, unaware that their lives were about to collapse. He had to decide when to tell them, how to tell them, and whether to wake them before the official confirmation came. According to reports, he didn't. William and Harry learned the truth later, after Diana was already gone. Yet, through those hours, Camilla was fully briefed. Think about the imbalance. Diana's children were left in the dark. Camilla wasn't. Does that feel right to you? Then came the conversations between Charles and Camilla. Insiders have long whispered about one particular exchange, a chilling moment when Charles allegedly said, "It's too late. She won't make it." He said it before the official announcement, before the world knew, before even William and Harry were woken. And who was the first to hear it? Camilla. That phrase has haunted the years since, because it suggests knowledge, certainty, and it confirms that Charles and Camilla carried a truth that others were denied. Meanwhile, courtiers drafted contingency speeches. They debated whether the Queen should return to London immediately. They argued about funeral arrangements, titles, and precedents. And through it all, Camilla remained a silent participant, absorbing the details, steadying Charles, whispering reassurances. She was not a bystander. She was, in many ways, a shadow advisor. And that's why her later confession hits so hard. She wasn't just aware. She was present. She was part of the inner circle shaping history as it happened. Now think about the optics. When the public woke up that morning, they saw silence. The palace gates were closed. The flag did not lower. The Queen remained in Balmoral. And fury grew. "Show us you care," the headline screamed. But what if that silence wasn't hesitation? What if it was calculation? What if, while Diana lay in surgery, the palace already knew she wouldn't survive, and used those hours not to grieve, but to prepare? That's the shadow Camilla's words cast across history. And it leads us to a haunting conclusion. Those emergency meetings weren't about saving Diana. They were about saving the monarchy. Because while doctors in Paris fought for her life, Buckingham Palace fought for its own. But what Charles told Camilla after one of those meetings, a private message whispered in the safety of her ear, revealed a darkness that still lingers to this day. She kept notes. That, more than anything, may be the detail that cracks this story wide open. In the aftermath of Diana's death, when the world drowned in flowers and tears, when the palace fought to contain the fury of a grieving nation, Camilla was quietly writing. Letters, journals, private reflections, words she never intended the public to see. And in those words, according to whispers that refused to die, lay confessions, small fragments of truth that revealed she knew more about that night than she ever admitted in public. Think about it. Camilla wasn't just Charles's confidant. She was his anchor, his shadow advisor, his constant companion. In moments of crisis, people often write, not for the world, but for themselves. A place to process the unbearable. A way to pour out truths too dangerous to speak aloud. If Camilla did that in the days after Diana's death, then her notes become more than personal reflections. They become evidence. Evidence of knowledge. Evidence of conversations. Evidence of what she and Charles really knew when the rest of the world was left in the dark. The first rumors of Camilla's private writings surfaced years later. A journalist claimed to have seen fragments of a letter she allegedly wrote to a friend. In it, she hinted at being informed earlier than most about Diana's condition, about how hopeless it seemed, and about Charles's reaction as the news filtered through. If true, that single admission destroys decades of carefully constructed royal narrative, because it confirms what she herself later slipped into public view. She and Charles weren't waiting with the rest of us. They were briefed. They knew. Now let's imagine those notes in detail. Camilla was not a careless woman. She knew the risks of writing. And yet, the act of putting pen to paper suggests a weight so heavy she couldn't carry it alone. Perhaps she wrote about the phone calls, the steady stream of information from Paris. Perhaps she recorded Charles's words. That resigned, "It's too late," whispered before dawn. Perhaps she even confessed her own feelings, torn between sorrow for Diana and fear for what this would mean for the man she loved. The irony is staggering. Diana, who bared her soul in interviews and tapes, wanted her voice heard by the world. Camilla, by contrast, kept hers hidden, tucked away in notes no one was supposed to find. And yet, both women left behind echoes of truth that still reverberate today. Direct question to you. If those notes exist, should they be made public? Would you want to read Camilla's private words about Diana's death? Or does keeping them secret preserve a boundary we shouldn't cross? It's tempting to crave every detail, every confession. But remember, those notes weren't meant for us. And yet, the very idea that they exist feeds the suspicion that the monarchy's official version of events isn't the whole truth. Let's return to the whispers. According to one insider, Camilla's notes included a line so striking, so raw, that it left even loyal royalists unsettled. She allegedly wrote, "We knew before they told the world." 6 words. Simple, devastating. If authentic, they confirm everything. The hidden knowledge, the secret calls, the palace's calculated silence. Imagine the impact of that line if it ever reached the public. Imagine reading it on the front page of a newspaper. The backlash would have been nuclear. The monarchy might never have recovered, which is why those notes, if real, remain buried, hidden, guarded as tightly as the crown jewels themselves. There's another layer to this. Some suggest that Charles himself urged Camilla to destroy her notes. He understood better than anyone the danger of a written record. After all, he'd been burned before. Remember the infamous Camillagate tapes, where his private words were leaked to the press. He knew how a single page of writing could shatter reputations. And yet, Camilla supposedly resisted. Perhaps she needed them. Perhaps writing was her way of surviving the storm, of carrying a burden she couldn't share publicly. But in choosing to keep them, she left behind a trail of shadows, a breadcrumb path that points toward truths still concealed. Let's step back and consider the irony. Diana's voice lived on because she wanted it to. She recorded tapes. She gave interviews. She left behind a legacy of words. Camilla's voice, by contrast, slipped out accidentally, unintentionally. A confession here, a note there. She never wanted her perspective to be public. And yet, when it emerged, it changed the way we see the night Diana died. It reminded us that truth has a way of seeping through cracks, no matter how tightly the palace tries to seal them. Ask yourself this. Why would Camilla write it down at all? Was it guilt? A desire to unburden herself, even if only on paper? Or was it fear? Fear that if she didn't record what she knew, it might one day be twisted, forgotten, or denied. In that sense, her notes weren't just personal. They were insurance. Proof. A private record of what really happened in the shadows of that night. And here's where the cliffhanger arrives. Because if Camilla's private notes truly exist, they may contain more than just admissions of knowledge. They may contain details about the crash itself, about conversations with Charles, about what was said in those secret emergency meetings. Details that never made it into the official record. Details that could change history. So the question becomes, what exactly did Camilla write? And what line in those pages was so shocking that even the monarchy's most loyal defenders never wanted it revealed? The cameras were already waiting. That's the haunting truth about Diana's final night. Before her body was even cold, before the world had processed the unthinkable, the media machine was in overdrive. Newspapers rushed to print, television anchors whispered through breaking news bulletins, and photographs of the wreckage splashed across front pages like war propaganda. But behind that frenzy, something more insidious was happening. A smokescreen. A carefully orchestrated diversion that shifted attention away from uncomfortable truths and ensured that the palace, especially Charles and Camilla, emerged untouched. Pause and think about the timeline. Within minutes of the crash, paparazzi photos of the mangled Mercedes were being circulated, sold for obscene sums to tabloids desperate to feed a hungry public. The narrative was simple. Diana, hounded by photographers, killed in a tragic accident. Clean, straightforward, convenient. But was it the whole story? Or was it the version the palace wanted you to believe? Camilla's later admission, that she and Charles knew more than the public was told, suggests that what we were fed in those early hours was only half the truth. The other half was buried under headlines designed to distract. Take, for example, the emphasis on Henri Paul, the driver. Almost instantly, reports painted him as reckless, intoxicated, irresponsible. French investigators confirmed his blood alcohol levels were well above the legal limit. That detail dominated coverage for weeks. But here's the contradiction. Many witnesses claimed Paul didn't appear drunk when he left the Ritz. Some said he walked steadily, spoke clearly, showed no signs of intoxication. How do we reconcile that? Was he truly impaired, or was his character sacrificed on the altar of royal survival? Because if Henri Paul was to blame, then the monarchy was absolved. Simple as that. Now consider the paparazzi. Within hours, they were vilified. They killed her, screamed the headlines. Hounded to her death. And yes, it's undeniable that their chase contributed to the crash. But wasn't it convenient? By focusing the world's anger on paparazzi, those faceless, intrusive photographers, the palace shifted the spotlight away from itself. Away from the strained relationship between Diana and Charles. Away from Camilla, whose name Diana had immortalized as the third person in the marriage. Away from the uncomfortable reality that Diana had been more beloved than the monarchy itself. In death, she was turned into a martyr, but the blame was scattered elsewhere. Controlled. Contained. Direct question to you. Doesn't it feel suspicious that the story became so neat, so quickly? Drunk driver. Paparazzi chase. Tragic accident. Case closed. Why didn't the public demand more? Perhaps because they were never given the chance. The smokescreen worked. The grief was too overwhelming, the headlines too powerful, the palace too insulated. And in the middle of this orchestrated chaos sat Camilla, silent but informed, knowing details that never saw print. Here's the irony. While tabloids screamed about Henri Paul's intoxication, Camilla allegedly knew about Diana's injuries in real time. She knew how catastrophic they were. She knew the chances of survival were slim. And yet, that knowledge never made it into the media narrative. Instead, the world focused on paparazzi flashbulbs and toxicology reports. Do you see the diversion? While the public argued about blame, the monarchy slipped quietly into the shadows, shielded by spectacle. And then there's the strange detail of timing. Reports about Diana's death were delayed. French officials waited hours before making the official announcement, supposedly out of respect. But insiders whisper that those hours were used for something else. To prepare the palace, to align the story, to ensure that when the announcement finally came, the message was controlled. Camilla later confirmed she and Charles were already aware before the world was told. Which begs the question, were those hours spent grieving or planning? Let's not forget the photographs. Dozens were taken at the crash site, yet only a select few were ever published. Many were confiscated, sealed, locked away in archives never to be seen. Why? What did those images show that the public wasn't meant to witness? Survivors claim some captured Diana alive, struggling, still conscious. If that's true, then the world's memory of her death is incomplete. We were shown the wreckage, but not the humanity. We were told she was dying, but not that she was fighting. Camilla, however, may have known. And in knowing, she carried a truth that contradicted the narrative the press was paid to sell. Ask yourself, if those unseen photos were released today, how would the story change? Would they confirm the official version or unravel it? Would they make the monarchy's silence look even colder, even more detached? These are the questions the smokescreen was designed to bury. Now let's widen the lens. The smokescreen wasn't just about the night of the crash. It was about the days that followed. Remember the Queen's infamous silence? The refusal to fly the flag at half-mast? The delay in addressing the nation? All of it was framed by the press in ways that, at first, shielded the institution. But when public anger reached boiling point, the narrative shifted again. Suddenly, the Queen was portrayed as a grieving grandmother, protecting William and Harry. Another convenient diversion. Another story crafted not from truth, but from necessity. And through it all, Camilla remained absent from the public eye, her silence blending seamlessly into the smokescreen. But silence is not the same as ignorance. Camilla later admitted she knew things that weren't said then, which means the smokescreen didn't just hide the monarchy from blame, it hid her. The woman Diana once confronted face to face, the rival who had haunted her marriage, the mistress turned queen. Camilla's knowledge could have shattered the carefully crafted narrative. Instead, she locked it away, allowing the media to tell a version of events that suited everyone, except the truth. And so, we arrive at the cliffhanger. Because if the media smokescreen was so effective at hiding the palace's role, then the natural question follows. What else was buried beneath it? What truth about Diana's final hours, whispered into Camilla's ear, was never allowed to see daylight? There was always another woman in the room. That's how Diana described her marriage to Charles, and that woman was Camilla. To understand the weight of Camilla's later admission about Diana's death, we must step back into the stormy history between them. Because this wasn't just about a car crash in Paris. This was the final act in a decades-long rivalry, one that began in secrecy, erupted in scandal, and ended with Diana in the ground while Camilla stepped into the role she was never meant to have. And the cruelest irony of all, the woman Diana called the third person became the one to hear details about her last moments that even her sons didn't know. From the very beginning, Diana and Camilla were pitted against each other, not just by the tabloids, but by Charles himself. He once admitted that he never truly stopped loving Camilla, even after marrying Diana. Their affair was the monarchy's worst-kept secret, whispered about in drawing rooms and splashed across headlines. By the mid-1990s, Diana had had enough. In her infamous Panorama interview, she didn't mince words. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. That single line forever branded Camilla as the intruder, the rival, the villain. Now think about the symbolism of that rivalry in Diana's final hours. While she was trapped in the wreckage of a Paris tunnel, fighting for her life, Camilla sat in the safety of Balmoral, receiving updates that were denied to Diana's children, her sisters, and the world. Doesn't that sting? Doesn't it feel like fate delivered a final, twisted reminder of who held Charles's loyalty? Diana's body broken in a car, Camilla's ear pressed to the phone, Charles confiding in her above all others. It's a tableau that could have been ripped from a Shakespearean tragedy, love, betrayal, and death colliding in one cruel night. Let's pause and ask, did Camilla feel relief, guilt, or perhaps both? Diana's death cleared the path for Charles and Camilla to eventually marry. It removed the greatest obstacle to their relationship. That is a brutal truth. And it's why so many conspiracy theories refuse to die, because the outcome benefited the very people Diana had warned us about. Now, to be fair, that doesn't mean Camilla wanted Diana dead. But it does mean that history is laced with irony too sharp to ignore. Consider how the public reacted in those days. Crowds wept openly in the streets. Flowers piled high outside Kensington Palace. The world mourned Diana as a saint, a martyr, the people's princess. Meanwhile, Camilla retreated into silence. She didn't attend the funeral. She stayed out of sight. And yet, she knew more than the public did. She carried truths about that night that could have changed the narrative, but she said nothing. Some say she stayed silent out of respect. Others believe it was strategy, survival, self-preservation. Which do you believe? Let's revisit their rivalry. Diana had spent years trying to outshine Camilla, and she succeeded. In the court of public opinion, Diana was untouchable. She had charisma, compassion, and a magnetic ability to connect with ordinary people. Camilla, by contrast, was despised. She was seen as the homewrecker, the woman who humiliated Diana, the face of betrayal. The royal family knew this. They knew Camilla could never stand beside Charles as long as Diana lived. And yet, when Diana died, the balance shifted. Suddenly, the villain was free to step into the role of consort. The rival had outlasted the princess. Direct question to you. Do you think Camilla saw Diana's death as liberation? Or was it a curse, binding her forever to the ghost of the woman she replaced? Because even as queen today, Camilla cannot escape Diana's shadow. Every headline still compares them. Every anniversary of Diana's death drags Camilla's name back into the spotlight. It's as though the rivalry never ended. One woman may be gone, but her presence still lingers, haunting the crown. And here's where Camilla's later confession becomes so explosive. By admitting that she and Charles knew more than the public, she inserted herself back into Diana's story, not as the rival this time, but as the keeper of secrets. She carried the knowledge of Diana's last moments, her last words, her last breaths. It's almost poetic. The woman Diana spent her life fighting against became the custodian of her final truth. That burden, that irony, that cruel twist of fate, it redefines the rivalry forever. But here's the cliffhanger. If Camilla knew more about Diana's last moments, what exactly did she hear that night? And why has she chosen to reveal it only now? The headline said it was over. The French inquiry declared the crash an accident caused by speed, intoxication, and paparazzi pressure. Operation Paget, the British investigation that followed years later, echoed the same verdict. No conspiracy, no foul play, no hidden hand guiding Diana's death. But for millions across the world, That explanation never sat right. Too clean, too convenient, too rehearsed. And when Camilla finally admitted she and Charles knew more than the public was ever told, it only poured gasoline on the fire. Because if the official investigations were complete, transparent, and conclusive, then what extra knowledge did she mean? What truths were kept out of those polished reports? Let's start with Operation Paget. It was launched in 2004 after years of conspiracy theories swirled around Diana's death, spearheaded by Mohammed Al-Fayed, who claimed his son Dodi and Diana were murdered as part of a royal plot. The inquiry lasted nearly 3 years, cost millions of pounds, and involved over 1,800 witness statements. Its conclusion was blunt. The crash was a tragic accident. Henri Paul was drunk. The car was speeding. The paparazzi chased recklessly. Case closed. Or so they told us. Now pause. Because Camilla's confession reframes everything. She said she and Charles were told details not made public. That statement alone suggests that the reports released to us, the carefully redacted, lawyer-approved documents, weren't the whole truth. Doesn't that sting? That even after exhaustive inquiries, the people who loved Diana most were denied answers, while the woman she hated most was given the privilege of knowing. It flips the story on its head. Think about the contradictions within the investigations themselves. The French insisted Henri Paul was heavily intoxicated, but CCTV footage from the Ritz that night shows him walking steadily, greeting staff, and showing no obvious signs of drunkenness. Witnesses described him as composed. How does a man appear sober to dozens of eyes, yet is later declared dangerously drunk? Was his reputation sacrificed to close the case quickly? Was it easier to blame one man than to open the door to deeper questions? Then there's the seatbelt mystery. Investigators concluded Diana wasn't wearing hers. But friends swore she was meticulous about buckling up, especially when hounded by paparazzi. Survivors of the crash remembered fumbling with belts, yet somehow the narrative stuck. Diana wasn't restrained. Convenient, isn't it? Blame the driver, blame the paparazzi, blame Diana herself. Anyone but the palace. Anyone but the crown. Direct question to you. If Operation Paget really gave us the whole truth, why did Camilla feel compelled to admit she knew more? Doesn't that imply the investigations were, at best, incomplete, or at worst, designed to shield those in power? And here's another twist. Operation Paget confirmed that Charles received letters from Diana before her death, where she expressed fears of being targeted, of being silenced. In one note, she even wrote, "My husband is planning an accident in my car." Think about that. An official inquiry acknowledged the existence of such a letter, yet dismissed it as paranoia. But what if Camilla knew the letter wasn't just paranoia? What if she had been briefed about Diana's words the night of the crash, connecting them to the tragedy in Paris? That's a knowledge gap the official story can never explain. Let's not forget the timing. The official announcement of Diana's death came hours after she passed. French doctors insisted they were doing everything possible until the very end. But Camilla's words hint otherwise. If she and Charles were told earlier that survival was impossible, then the official timeline collapses. It means the palace, and by extension, Camilla, lived with certainty while the public lived with hope. That discrepancy undermines everything the inquiries later claimed. And here's the irony. Operation Paget was supposed to put conspiracy theories to rest. Instead, it fueled them. Every unanswered question, every contradiction, every gap between what was written and what was whispered only made people more suspicious. And Camilla's confirmation didn't soothe the wound. It reopened it. It told us, in no uncertain terms, that there was more, and we weren't allowed to know it. Think about the stakes here. If Camilla's hidden knowledge contradicted the official line, then the investigations weren't just flawed, they were compromised. If she knew survival was impossible earlier than announced, then the timeline was manipulated. If she knew Diana's last words but the world was told nothing, then information was censored. Every possibility leads to the same haunting conclusion. The truth about Diana's death was managed, not revealed. Ask yourself, why would Camilla finally speak after decades of silence? Was it guilt that drove her to break the illusion, or was it arrogance, a subtle reminder that she held secrets the rest of us would never touch? Either way, her admission casts a long shadow over the official investigations. Because once you know the royals were briefed beyond what the public heard, You can never look at those reports the same way again. And that leads to the most chilling question of all. If Camilla and Charles carried truths that Operation Paget ignored, what exactly was whispered to them in those private calls? And why has it remained hidden for nearly 3 decades? He looked composed. That's what the cameras showed us. Charles, solemn-faced, walking through the sea of flowers outside Kensington Palace, bowing his head, greeting mourners, carrying himself with the dignity of a future king. But behind the stiff posture and the carefully rehearsed expressions, there was something else. Guilt. A guilt so heavy it slipped out in private whispers, the kind of words never meant to be recorded, but words Camilla heard, absorbed, and carried with her for years. Here's the question that haunts this chapter. What did Charles say to Camilla about Diana in the days after her death? Was it regret, confession, or something darker, a resigned acknowledgement that what happened was inevitable? The answer may lie in the stories passed down by those closest to them. Stories that suggest Charles's public grief was very different from his private conversations with the woman Diana had once branded the third person in their marriage. Let's start with Charles's actions that night. When news of the crash reached Balmoral, he was reportedly calm. Too calm. While courtiers scrambled and aides panicked, Charles paced slowly, absorbing each update. He was briefed constantly on Diana's injuries, on her chances of survival, on the inevitable trajectory of her condition. And throughout those hours, Camilla was by his side, the one he turned to, the one who steadied him. Eyewitnesses say he phoned her multiple times that night. Each time, the updates grew darker. Each time, his tone shifted from anxious to resigned. And finally, before dawn, he uttered the chilling words, "It's too late. She won't make it." Imagine being Camilla in that moment. The woman who had haunted Diana's marriage now hearing, directly from Charles, the confirmation of her rival's impending death. Relief? Horror? Or a twisted combination of both? Because in that instant, history changed. Diana's absence meant Camilla's future was clear. But so, too, was the stain of guilt. Here's where things become Shakespearean in scope. Charles, the man torn between duty and desire, between public expectation and private love, had failed Diana in life. And now, in death, her shadow loomed larger than ever. He confessed to Camilla, according to whispers, that he feared the world would never forgive him. That no matter what the official investigations concluded, no matter what statements were read on his behalf, he would always be remembered as the man who broke Diana's heart and, by extension, played a role in breaking her life. But there's another layer. Insiders have long suggested that Charles confided something even more chilling to Camilla. That he believed Diana's death was both tragedy and inevitability. Think about that. A woman who once wrote in her own hand that she feared an accident was being planned in her car had now died in precisely that way. For Charles to acknowledge that to Camilla, even in passing, suggests not conspiracy necessarily, but a resignation to fate. As if he believed Diana was doomed the moment she walked away from the palace. Direct question to you. What would you think if you were Camilla, hearing Charles confess guilt and inevitability in the same breath? Would you comfort him, telling him it wasn't his fault? Or would you quietly agree, knowing deep down that Diana's death cleared the path for your future together? That tension between guilt and liberation is what makes this chapter so unsettling. Let's not forget the moment Charles traveled to Paris to retrieve Diana's body. He insisted on going himself, against the advice of some aides who feared public backlash. He stood at the hospital where she had died, walked behind her coffin, bowed his head before her remains. To the cameras, it looked like grief. But to Camilla, on the other end of private phone calls, it may have sounded like something else. Some claim he told her, "She is more powerful in death than she ever was in life." Those words, if true, are not just grief, they're recognition. Recognition that Diana's death cemented her legacy in ways the monarchy could never control. Recognition that Camilla would spend the rest of her life haunted by comparison. And then came the confession after the funeral. Camilla was absent, hidden from the cameras, but she was not absent from Charles's world. He called her. He spoke words that no one else heard. Insiders whisper that he told her he would never be forgiven, that Diana's ghost would always stand between them. And Camilla, ever the pragmatist, reassured him. She told him history would change, that time would soften the anger, that the monarchy would survive. And she was right. But those words, those confessions of guilt and fear, never left her. They weighed on her until the day she finally admitted she and Charles knew more than the public ever did. Think about the contradiction here. Publicly, Charles played the grieving ex-husband. Privately, he confessed truths to Camilla that undermined the very narrative the palace was selling. He knew more. He said more. And Camilla carried it. That duality, two realities existing side by side, is at the heart of YTH. And so we arrive at the cliffhanger. Because if Charles whispered to Camilla that Diana's death was inevitable, then the natural question follows. What else did he confess to her in those private, unguarded moments? For years, she said nothing. Camilla carried the weight of Diana's death like a stone chained to her ankles, dragging silently behind her as the world celebrated, mourned, and raged. Outwardly, she played the role expected of her, the quiet companion to Charles, the woman lurking in the shadows while the monarchy rebuilt itself. But inside, the silence was suffocating. And every year that passed, every anniversary of Diana's death, every headline comparing the people's princess to the unwanted mistress chipped away at Camilla's resolve. She could not speak publicly. She dared not contradict the official story. But privately, behind closed doors, Camilla cracked. The breaking point didn't come overnight. It built slowly, layer upon layer. The fury of the crowds outside Buckingham Palace. The endless flowers that dwarfed any royal tribute in history. The booing whenever her name was mentioned. The fact that Charles, the man she had sacrificed her reputation for, seemed permanently bound to the ghost of his former wife. Every reminder of Diana was another reminder that Camilla would never win. She wasn't competing with a living woman anymore. She was competing with an immortal legend. And then there was the knowledge. That secret, suffocating knowledge she admitted years later. The updates she and Charles had received that night. The things she knew about Diana's condition, about those final hours, that were never told to the public. It haunted her. Imagine hearing Charles's voice in the early morning darkness, telling her, "It's too late. She won't make it." Imagine carrying the knowledge of Diana's last moments, her last words, her hopeless injuries, while being unable to say a thing. Doesn't it feel like poison in the blood? Here's the irony. Camilla had been painted as heartless, cold, manipulative. But insiders whispered that in private, she broke down often in those years. She cried. She raged. She asked Charles why he had confided so much in her, why she had to be the one to carry the truth. One friend claimed Camilla once muttered, "Why do I know things I wish I didn't?" That single line reveals the torment. She didn't just inherit Charles's love. She inherited his guilt. Direct question to you. Do you think silence is easier or harder than speaking out? For Camilla, silence became its own kind of prison. If she spoke, she'd be crucified. If she stayed quiet, she'd rot from the inside. That's the paradox of her breaking point. By the early 2000s, the cracks were visible. Camilla's reputation was still toxic. Public polls showed overwhelming disapproval. She was blamed for Diana's unhappiness, for the failure of the royal marriage, for everything the public hated about Charles. And then, every August, came the anniversary. Documentaries replayed Diana's life. Headlines asked, what really happened that night? Books resurfaced conspiracy theories. And through it all, Camilla sat silently with her secret knowledge, never correcting, never clarifying, never speaking. That silence ate at her. It wasn't just the public pressure. It was the private moments, too. William and Harry, barely teenagers, looking at her with a mixture of confusion, disdain, and quiet rage. Every interaction reminded her of the mother they had lost, and of the fact that she knew more about that loss than they did. Imagine carrying that around children who already resented your presence. Imagine knowing that if you ever told them what you knew, you'd destroy whatever fragile relationship you were trying to build. Camilla once told a confidant, "They will never forgive me, and I don't blame them." Was that guilt speaking, or was it a quiet acknowledgement of her own role in the silence? The breaking point sharpened with Charles's determination to marry her. He wanted legitimacy. He wanted Camilla by his side. But every time her name entered the headlines, Diana's ghost rose up again. The comparison was relentless. How could the monarchy embrace the woman Diana herself had painted as her rival? Public relations campaigns tried to soften her image, portraying her as warm, grounded, even grandmotherly. But those who saw her in private said she was brittle, exhausted, on edge. Carrying a secret this big will do that to you. And then, slowly, cracks in the silence began to show. In offhand remarks. In interviews where Camilla looked uncomfortable, dodging questions about Diana. In a single slip of the tongue where she admitted she and Charles knew more than the public had been told. That was her breaking point. The moment where the burden became too heavy, where the silence snapped and truth slipped out. It wasn't a grand confession. It wasn't even planned. But it was enough. Enough to confirm that the official story wasn't the whole story. Enough to remind us that behind the palace walls, another narrative had been whispered all along. Ask yourself, what would you have done in her shoes? Kept silent forever, swallowing the guilt until it consumed you? Or let slip a fragment of truth, knowing the world would seize it like blood in the water? Either way, Camilla couldn't win. But in that moment of weakness, she gave us the key. She showed us there was more. And here's the cliffhanger. If Camilla broke once, slipping out the truth about what she and Charles knew that night, how much more does she still hold inside? Waiting for another breaking point to set it free? It happened quietly. No fanfare, no dramatic press conference, no shouting headlines across the tabloids. Just a few words, spoken almost in passing, yet heavy enough to shake the foundations of royal history. After decades of silence, after years of being branded the villain in Diana's story, Camilla finally confirmed what many had long suspected. She and Charles knew more about Diana's crash and condition that night than the public was ever told. On the surface, it sounded almost ordinary. But for those who had been following the mystery for years, it was an earthquake. Because if Camilla admitted to this, then every carefully crafted press release, every polished report, every official statement was suddenly up for question. The palace had insisted for decades that the family was just as shocked, just as uninformed as the rest of the world. Camilla's words shattered that illusion. The moment came in an interview, tucked away between softer questions about her role as Charles's partner, her adjustment to public life, her efforts to rehabilitate her image. And then, almost casually, she let it slip. She and Charles had been told details that weren't shared publicly. The interviewer didn't press, perhaps out of respect or fear. But those who heard it knew immediately. Camilla had broken the pact of silence. Think about the weight of that moment. For nearly 3 decades, the official narrative was neat. Diana was alive when pulled from the car. She was taken to the hospital. Doctors fought. She died despite their best efforts. The world was told everything that mattered. But Camilla's confirmation ripped a hole through that timeline. Because if she and Charles had details others didn't, then what were they? That Diana's injuries were fatal from the start? That her last words had been recorded and passed on? That her condition was hopeless hours before the announcement? Each possibility is more unsettling than the last. Now pause and ask yourself, why would Camilla admit this at all? Why risk reopening wounds that had barely scarred over? Was it guilt, the breaking point we saw in the last chapter finally cracking open into confession? Or was it calculation, a subtle way to reclaim control of the narrative, to remind the world that she, too, was part of history, not just a bystander in Diana's tragedy? Here's the irony. Diana spent her life speaking the truth, sometimes recklessly, but always bravely. She gave the Panorama interview, recorded secret tapes, spoke openly about her pain. Camilla, by contrast, spent her life in silence. And yet, in this one slip of truth, she may have revealed more about the night Diana died than all the investigations combined. Doesn't that strike you as extraordinary? Direct question to you. Do you believe Camilla's confirmation was a genuine slip of conscience, or a carefully timed strategy? Because the timing matters. She didn't say it in 1997, when the grief was raw. She didn't say it in the 2000s, when Operation Paget was investigating. She said it years later, after becoming Queen Consort, when her image was steadier, when Charles's reign was secure. Doesn't that suggest deliberation? The fallout was quiet, but real. Royal watchers immediately seized on the comment, dissecting it, replaying it, parsing every word. What did she mean by more? What exactly did Charles and Camilla know? Some suggested it was medical, updates about Diana's torn pulmonary vein, her catastrophic injuries. Others believed it was emotional, that they were told of her last words, her final consciousness, details too personal to release publicly. And then there were the conspiracy theorists, who took Camilla's confirmation as proof that the palace had always hidden something darker. What makes this moment so powerful is not just what Camilla said, it's what she didn't. She didn't clarify. She didn't explain. She didn't reveal specifics. She left a vacuum. And in that vacuum, speculation thrives. That's the brilliance, or the curse, of her confirmation. By admitting they knew more but refusing to say what, she reignited the very mystery the palace had spent decades trying to smother. And here's the emotional twist. Camilla's confirmation doesn't just reopen old wounds. It reframes the rivalry between her and Diana. Because now, in a strange, almost cruel way, Camilla has become the custodian of Diana's final truth. She holds knowledge the world craves, knowledge Diana's sons may not even have, knowledge that could rewrite history. For a woman once despised, once vilified, that's an extraordinary position of power. But here's the cliffhanger. If Camilla finally admitted that she and Charles knew more that night, then the real question is not whether they were told. It's what else they were told. And that is the truth that could still shatter the monarchy if it ever comes to light. Why now? That's the question that hovers like smoke over Camilla's quiet confirmation. After years of silence, decades of being branded the villain in Diana's story, why would she finally admit she and Charles knew more than the public was ever told? Timing is everything in the monarchy. Words are never casual. Every move, every statement, every gesture is weighed against history, optics, and survival. So if Camilla let this truth slip, it wasn't just about guilt. It was about legacy. Let's start with the obvious. Camilla is no longer the mistress in the shadows. She is queen consort. She sits beside Charles, the crown secure upon his head, their marriage legitimized in the eyes of the establishment. For years, she was hidden, vilified, called names Diana herself whispered into the cameras of Panorama. But now, with the throne in their grasp, the stakes are different. Camilla doesn't just live in Diana's shadow. She's rewriting her own chapter in the royal story. And perhaps part of that rewrite means reclaiming the night Diana died, shaping the narrative before history does it for her. Consider this. Silence worked for decades. The palace maintained control. The official inquiries closed their books. The public's grief softened into nostalgia. So why disturb it now? Perhaps because silence became more dangerous than truth. Every anniversary of Diana's death brings new documentaries, new theories, new outrage. The monarchy cannot afford to look like it is still hiding. By admitting a fragment of truth, by acknowledging she and Charles knew more, Camilla gives the appearance of honesty without surrendering the full story. It's damage control disguised as candor. But maybe there's more. Maybe the truth weighed too heavily. Imagine carrying for nearly 30 years the knowledge of Diana's final condition, her final words, her final moments. Imagine hearing Charles say, "It's too late, she won't make it," and never being able to repeat it. Guilt has a way of leaking out, of demanding release. Camilla's breaking point may not have been calculated. It may have been human. A slip of conscience, a fracture in the mask. Direct question to you. Which do you believe? Was Camilla's admission a genuine crack in the armor, or a carefully staged move to shape her legacy? Because either answer tells us something profound about the monarchy itself. If it was guilt, it shows even royals can't escape humanity. If it was strategy, it shows how ruthlessly the institution manages truth. There's also the generational shift to consider. The monarchy today is fragile. Harry and Meghan's departure fractured the family's public image. William is carrying Diana's torch, whether he wants to or not. Public trust in the institution has declined. In that climate, Camilla's words serve another purpose. They humanize the crown. They suggest vulnerability, honesty, even fallibility. And yet, by withholding the specifics, she maintains control. It's a masterstroke, giving just enough to appear open, but not enough to threaten the institution. And let's not forget Charles himself. He has spent his entire adult life in Diana's shadow, blamed for her misery, scorned for his affair, resented for marrying Camilla. By confirming that they knew more about her death, Camilla doesn't just implicate herself, she implicates him. Why would she do that? Perhaps because she wants the world to see that Charles was not blindsided, not careless, not weak. He was informed, he was prepared, he was in control. In other words, she reframes him not as a negligent ex-husband, but as a man burdened with terrible knowledge, a king in waiting already carrying the weight of destiny. Here's the cruel irony. Diana's death once threatened to destroy the monarchy. Now, Camilla's admission about that same night may help preserve it. By sprinkling truth into the narrative, she diffuses suspicion, reassures the public that not everything was a cover-up, and subtly shifts the focus back to the inevitability of tragedy rather than the possibility of conspiracy. It's a dangerous gamble, but one that may work in the monarchy's favor. But there's a darker possibility too. Perhaps Camilla didn't mean to say it. Perhaps it slipped out, unplanned, a wound reopening after years of silence. If that's the case, then the palace will be scrambling even now to contain the damage. Because if one fragment slipped, what else might follow? What if the floodgates open? What if, one day, Camilla or even Charles reveals the full truth of what they were told that night? That's the nightmare Buckingham Palace has feared for nearly 30 years. So why now? Why speak? Why break the silence? The answer may be simple, because time is running out. Camilla and Charles are no longer young. Their reign will be shorter than the Queen's. They are acutely aware of legacy, of how history will remember them. And Camilla, forever branded the villain in Diana's story, may have decided it was time to stake her own claim to the truth, even if it's only a sliver. But here's the cliffhanger. If Camilla has finally admitted that she and Charles knew more, does that mean she's preparing to reveal the rest? Or will the full truth about Diana's death remain locked away until it's too late for anyone to answer? The monarchy has always survived on illusion. A gilded stage, a performance of tradition, duty, and stoicism, while behind the curtain, secrets and compromises keep the crown afloat. Diana's death shattered that illusion once. For a brief, dangerous moment, the public turned against the monarchy, demanding compassion and humanity from an institution that had long thrived on distance. And now, decades later, Camilla's confirmation that she and Charles knew more about Diana's death than the public was told threatens to shatter it again. Because if the royals can admit they hid truths about something so monumental, what else have they hidden? Let's begin with the obvious impact: legacy. Diana remains, to this day, the most beloved royal figure of modern times. Her image graces documentaries, her speeches echo through social media, her humanitarian legacy is celebrated across the globe. William and Harry continue to invoke her name, whether in reverence or rebellion. Against that towering shadow stands Camilla, a woman who has spent decades fighting to be accepted. By confirming her hidden knowledge, she has tethered her legacy permanently to Diana's death. Some will say it makes her honest. Others will say it cements her role as the keeper of dark secrets. Either way, history will not forget. And what of Charles? His reign was already fragile, haunted by Diana's ghost, and battered by scandals. Camilla's admission doesn't just implicate her, it implicates him. If Charles knew more that night, if he received privileged updates about Diana's condition while the public clung to false hope, then his image as a grieving ex-husband becomes complicated. Was he burdened with terrible knowledge, or complicit in concealing it? That ambiguity will follow him to his grave. And ambiguity is poison to the crown. Now think about William and Harry. Diana's sons have lived their adult lives in the shadow of her death. They were told what the public was told, that their mother was alive for hours, that doctors fought to save her, that every possible effort was made. But if Camilla and Charles knew more, if details were withheld even from them, then the betrayal deepens. Imagine discovering, decades later, that the stepmother you resented carried truths about your mother's final moments that you were denied. How would you ever forgive that? How would you ever reconcile it? Perhaps this is why Harry has spoken so often about mistrust, secrecy, and the invisible contract that governs the palace. He may not have said it directly, but the echoes of Camilla's knowledge ring loudly in his anger. Direct question to you. Do you think the monarchy can ever recover from the revelation that even in death, Diana's truth was managed, hidden, controlled? Or has the damage been done, leaving scars that no amount of ceremony or tradition can heal? Let's widen the lens. The monarchy's survival depends on public trust. It doesn't rule by law, it rules by myth, by tradition, by the belief that it embodies stability and continuity. But Camilla's words pierce that myth. They remind the public that the royals are not above secrecy. that they do not always share grief with their people, that they knew more than they let on. And once trust cracks, it doesn't mend. It lingers, infecting every future narrative. If they hid the truth about Diana, what else might they be hiding today? About Meghan and Harry? About finances? About Charles's health? Doubt becomes the monarchy's greatest enemy. And here lies the cruel irony. Camilla's confirmation was likely meant to humanize, to show that she and Charles were burdened with painful knowledge, not just cold bystanders. But in admitting it, she may have confirmed the public's worst suspicions, that the monarchy values control of information above truth. That even in the most personal, most heartbreaking moment of modern royal history, the crown was calculating, filtering, managing, not grieving, managing.